The World We Create, From God to Market, by Tomas Björkman, read by Mark Meadows. About 16,000 years ago, the glaciers start to move north and the environmental conditions in the Middle East begin to change. The animals we rely on also move north as the climate becomes drier, and 13,000 years ago it becomes ever harder to find wild wheat, which has now become an important part of our diet to compensate the loss of wild game. This impels us to learn how to cultivate the wheat and catch the animals that remain without eating them all at once. Drought also causes more people to live together in the increasingly fewer fertile square meters available. Without anywhere to go, as most of the land is already occupied, we settle down as farmers and shepherds. The emergence of agriculture entails a revolution by virtue of the vastly greater energy consumption of a single species in total and per capita, and the massively greater number of people it brings into existence. The increase in the share of biomatter subject to a single species is spectacular. The pace at which these developments take place is also, compared to those of the preceding foraging regime, very rapid. Instead of hundreds of thousands of years, these developments happen in just a few thousand. Humans start to sustain themselves in ways that depart significantly from any other species before. The crucial change is the way in which we alter our relation to nature by deliberately transforming it to serve our needs. Until this point, every living species has simply lived off whatever resources nature could provide. And even if living organisms have always changed the environment and other species in their surroundings, when humans start to domesticate plants and animals, it is the first time a species seeks to do so deliberately and with so great efficiency. This novel mode of production, however, not only changes the way we sustain ourselves, it also brings equally revolutionary changes to the ways in which we organize society. Agricultural production makes it possible for human numbers to grow far beyond what any naturally occurring resource could sustain. And in these densely populated sedentary communities, entirely new ways of organizing social relations emerge as a result. As societies get larger and more productive, they also get far more socially stratified, and with time, more centralized as well. In a few thousand years, agricultural production gives birth to complex, literate civilizations with well-organized bureaucracies, cities with inhabitants that think and act very differently from their foraging predecessors, and powerful elites that control large armies to control these people and keep outsiders at bay. When the first pyramid-building civilizations appear in the Middle East, a second chapter in the development of the agrarian regime begins, and with that, a qualitatively very different way of life. Agriculture is a very powerful meme system. The societies who embrace this meme system will not only secure their own survival, but, as their numbers soar and they expand into virgin lands, even ensure the mimetic proliferation of agriculture across the planet. After emerging in a few regions, agriculture spreads to most of the world through a complex process, a combination of migration, diffusion, and local invention and reinvention, often along new or existing networks of exchange. After the first emergence of agriculture in the Middle East, it appears independently in at least 6 other locations: China, Papua New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of India. So, given that it emerged autonomously in so many different regions not yet connected with each other, agriculture appears to be a universal developmental feature, not just a fluke, which seems to occur when certain societal and ecological preconditions are met. In all these regions, agriculture first appears in hilly areas with subtropical climates, suggesting that such environments provide the optimal Goldilocks conditions for agriculture to emerge from scratch. In addition, we also see the emergence of nomadic societies, usually consisting of a few hundred people, that follow the animals' movements and subsist on cattle rearing as well as trade and war with the sedentary farming communities. In many areas, the emergence of agriculture is far from an immediate event, but coexists with traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyles, to which agriculture is only a supplement to foraging for thousands of years. This is not strange. Even if agriculture can support larger populations than foraging, and hence outcompete these lifeways in the long run, foragers have good reasons to resist the transition. Early agriculture brings new forms of stress and disease. Less varied diets, overwork, bacterial and viral infections and famines are endemic in farming communities, and from skeletal remains we see a sudden increase in teeth problems, and skeletons grow to be shorter on average. Life expectancy and child mortality do not improve either, and violence seems to have increased as well. These circumstances have led Yuval Harari to call agriculture history's biggest fraud, and David Christian to conclude that it did more to depress standards of human welfare than to raise them. It has even been theorized that the earlier life of foragers was the original affluent society, one in which all the people's wants are easily satisfied. With the transition to agriculture, we have to exchange the somewhat freer hunter-gatherer lifestyle for a more toilsome sedentary existence tending our crops. No longer do we freely roam the lands. The arguably more gratifying hunting life is replaced by back-breaking farm work and a monotone diet largely consisting of starch, while leisure time declines considerably. In addition to these noteworthy deprivations, women also get a particularly raw deal. Agriculture generally favours male dominance, so, as a consequence, women have to give up some of the freedoms they enjoyed in the foraging regime. This is partly a result of the higher birth rates agrarian life brings about. Young children do not need to be carried around any longer, and the new grain-based diet shortens birth intervals so that children can be weaned from an earlier age. When females breastfeed children for shorter periods of time, the risk of getting pregnant increases accordingly. Breastfeeding causes a considerable delay in the return of ovulation after pregnancy. The abundance of energy-rich grain diets also makes females reach puberty earlier, thus raising the prospect of even more babies. Contrary to the nomadic lifestyle, where children remain a burden for a much longer time, the additional births are even encouraged, since children can contribute to the agrarian household economy from a younger age. Consequently, the number of humans grows rapidly following the agricultural revolution. With time, the sedentary way of life makes people forget the intricate knowledge of nature that had helped them survive as hunter-gatherers. Sedentism becomes a trap. Once people have got accustomed to an agrarian lifestyle, they can no longer go back. Not even if they wanted, or if conditions allowed for it, since they have now lost the skills required for a successful life as foragers. In most cases, however, there is no going back either way because of the growing number of mouths to be fed. In a development known as path dependency, the increased amount of food leads to more births, which again increases the demand of more extensive agriculture, so as to further increase birth rates in an ever-continuing upward spiral. Naturally, people are tempted by the larger amounts of food that can be acquired from agriculture and the security of growing their own food supply. But since the life of farmers is a more toilsome and demanding existence, and since humans rarely engage in the many difficulties a transition to an entirely new form of life entails when the contemporary is able to sufficiently meet their needs, the transition to agriculture is unlikely to have been entirely voluntary. Necessity, rather than free choice, is most likely what makes us become farmers in the first place. A shortage of resources, competition from other humans, and no other ways to ensure survival are probably what spur the first human societies to adopt agriculture. With agriculture, we start to influence the natural environment to a greater extent than before. We begin to consciously alter our ecological surroundings in ways that better suit our needs. Since only a few select animals and plants are useful to us, these are prioritized in favor of others, which results in a decline in untamed natural complexity. As such, the increase in human complexity is directly linked to decreased biological complexity, corresponding with the universal rule that high complexity in one part of the universe results in lower complexity in another. In order to fuel the increase in human complexity, the extermination of many species follows, along with soil erosion and deforestation, which in some parts of the world even cause local climatic changes. Sometimes the depletion of the natural environment even deteriorates living conditions to the degree that agrarian societies collapse from time to time when ecological boundaries are transgressed. Another type of horror afflicting humanity is new diseases. Since we live closer to one another and to our animals, our villages become hotbeds for the spread of microbes and viruses. Many of our diseases which we are immune to today are mutated animal diseases. These would later have disastrous consequences for the peoples outside Africa and Eurasia, where they did not have access to domesticable animals and thus did not develop immunity to their diseases. The relationship between humans and nature starts to fundamentally change. Our ambition to reshape the natural environment gives us a growing sense of separation between the natural and human worlds. The feeling of connection and belonging to nature, prevalent among foragers to this day, gradually diminishes and is replaced by a feeling of alienation towards nature and a sense of the natural world as indifferent and sometimes even hostile towards us. The new agricultural living conditions catalyze the development of new ways of thinking and acting. The old animist thought perspective is no longer sufficient. To survive, we must develop our culture. We can no longer rely on magical happenings, but need to unravel the mysteries of nature to decide when it is time to sow and harvest. This fundamentally changes our perceptions of nature and reality, as we have to adapt our lives to the cyclical rhythms of agricultural production. The first forms of calendars are invented, which may have entailed some of our first formal conceptions of time. To help us determine the right time for sowing and harvest, we start giving greater attention to celestial constellations, which start to play a stronger role in people's imagination. With the emergence of increasingly powerful leaders, this may help explain the transition from spirit beings in nature to powerful gods tied to celestial objects. As in hunter-gatherer societies, the worldview of early agrarian societies is concerned with spirit beings with great supernatural powers inhabiting the natural world. Thereafter, with the transition to more advanced forms of agriculture, these narratives become much more institutionalized. New forms of social conduct and self-discipline are also required in the agrarian regime, since the work in the fields requires greater efforts and social coordination, especially since we can no longer consume all the available food when we feel like it. Forward planning and retaining, rather than immediately consuming all the available food, is a major break with previous modes of production and consumption, and thought. We must learn to become more disciplined and overcome our immediate needs and impulses. Humans' immediate and instinct-given impulses have to be repressed, and the way evolution has adapted the human mind to a life of hunting and gathering on the African savanna must be transgressed. Even the human body has to transgress its evolutionary limits as the hardships of monotonous, back-breaking farm work, to which it is ill-suited, has to be endured as well. This conduct has to be learned. New memes have to be developed, as such acts of self-restraint cannot be derived from instinct. Norbert Elias has pointed out that the new sort of self-discipline that agrarian society demanded, to a considerable degree, had to be instilled by external constraints. This circumstance, he argues, may have given rise to a new class of priest-chiefs, perhaps descending from shamans, who, with the aid of new religious beliefs and practices, provide binding solutions to the problem of self-discipline by instilling this kind of behavior in people. New social imaginaries are required, and it is crucial that we agree on them as truths, that we believe them to be real. Groups with strong priest chiefs and effectual narratives may then have prospered more than those without, which, as a matter of evolutionary logic, causes this kind of social structure to become dominant. About 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, the first city-states appear in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and a little later in the Indus Valley and China. Cities are crucial to the emergence of states by their very nature as concentrators of power. They bring together authority and labour previously diffused over a large area into a single node of power, while they simultaneously create needs for novel measures of power projection and labour coordination as they grow and new organisational problems arise. So, as the need for central regulation increases and measures are taken to accommodate this, so do the available resources for central authorities too. Most early states emerge in river valleys, often surrounded by almost inhabitable lands and near subtropical mountain areas where agriculture was pioneered thousands of years earlier. That states do not emerge in these areas, in many regions escaping central control up until modern times, is probably due to the difficulty for armies and bureaucrats to operate in such mountainous environments. Instead, it is in the nearby river valleys, where conditions for irrigation are present, that we see the first instances of state-like structures. Irrigation requires large amounts of cooperation that are only feasible through strong organizations, which accordingly prompts the need for central regulation. The flat plains, rich soils and rivers suitable for irrigation projects thus explain that state-like regimes first emerged in the densely populated urban regions in southern Mesopotamia and Egypt. Cities also often emerge at the center of networks of exchange. Accordingly, southern Mesopotamia happens to be located between two resource-rich areas, the northern arc of the Fertile Crescent and the Persian Gulf, and thus becomes a hub region in this early, far-reaching network. As regional networks of exchange gradually become larger, more diverse, and more complex, new hierarchical structures begin to appear with large cities at the centers, where wealth, knowledge, and people are concentrated in ever-growing numbers. The outlying regions thus begin to depend on some subordinated niche within the new networks of wealth and power, which further increases the centrality and wealth of the major cities. In addition, the increasing aridity in the Middle East may have forced people into the narrow straits of fertile land along the two rivers of Mesopotamia and along the Nile in Egypt, increasing population density and thereby the size of cities further. Cities are more than large villages in that they are the first wholly humanized environments. Cities are characterized by having large numbers of people who themselves do not engage in farm work, but nevertheless are supported by the surplus production of agriculture. This makes new forms of complex division of labor and specialization possible, such as full-time artistry and trade. The new agrarian cities are hotbeds for novel memes to emerge. The organizational issues that appear as society grows larger, the new living conditions in the urban environments, and the growing number of people, goods, and ideas that circulate in the cities all contribute to the creation of new memes and higher levels of complexity. The growing complexity that emerges in the dense centers of the cities can be likened to the way in which the pressure in a star gives rise to more complex atoms. As the gravity of the city pulls in matter from afar, new memes are forged in its center. That is, as growing numbers of people and goods are caught in the gravitational field of the city and brought to its center, the density of these resources in a single location henceforth allows for increased social and technological complexity to develop. As agriculture develops and spreads over a larger area and the population grows accordingly, settlements come ever closer to each other and coalesce with time into larger societies. The cities become powerhouses that gradually extend their influence and power in the region. The surrounding villages are soon subordinated by the exchange hubs that they trade with, and eventually the biggest and most powerful cities extend their power to other, smaller cities, creating political structures approaching the form of territorial states. With this development, human complexity has entered a new stage. We get a denser weave with ever-increasing complexity in evolutionary cultural development disseminated via memes. With the closer connections between cities, we also start to see the languages of powerful cities become dominant in a larger area, whereby memes can spread more easily. We can communicate with, be inspired by, and ourselves influence others in a wider common sphere than ever before. But a shared language entails more than the ability for us to talk to each other. Of equal importance is the way in which it makes it possible to live in common cultures where we share the same symbol world, even with people we do not know personally. Our symbol world grows larger, and the number of people who contribute to our collective learning process goes up, so as to further the development of new levels of technological, social, and cultural complexity. This also makes it possible to create social imaginaries, myths, and narratives that extend to ever larger numbers of people. With the emergence of the first city-states in southern Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, Sumerian society has become so large and complex that relations cannot be managed within the animist kinship way of thinking. New class structures start to emerge, categorized by occupation and city of origin. But kinship continues to be important among the lower levels of society, and symbolic forms of kinship survive in religious thinking. In parallel with the emergence of ranked hierarchies among humans, so do elite gods with equal demands of appropriate respect begin to appear. And to honor these, special buildings are erected for them. In all the locations we find monumental architecture, it is evident that powerful leaders existed so as to coordinate the labor-intensive work of erecting such structures. This is both a sign and an instrument of power, since leaders can thereby inspire awe in the gods, but also in themselves by being the ones who deal directly with these powerful beings. State religions often become cultural regimes to foster social cohesion and legitimize the authority of rulers. The narratives of state religions are usually based on notions of supernatural forces and symbolic kinship, with rulers portrayed as descendants of the sun or the moon and fathers or sometimes mothers of their people. These religions become dominant in the new public spheres of the cities, while the older farmer religions remain important at the local level. The differentiation into state and popular religions coincides with the differentiation of social life into a public sphere dominated by males and a subordinated domestic sphere where women are increasingly secluded. As the cities grow, more and more people have to live in close proximity with people that are not kin and with whom they do not share personal relations. New moral guidelines on how to deal with strangers are therefore needed. State elites thus begin to formulate laws and forge overarching state identities with the aid of religions and bureaucracies. The result is what Benedict Anderson has called imagined communities, since people become capable of feeling some kind of shared identity with others they do not know personally. Our ability to forge social imaginaries is thereby used to create new identities that are better suited to the new conditions in complex agrarian societies. Eventually, the territorial states evolve into what we sometimes refer to as civilizations. With these, we now have even larger societies and cities with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. New symbolic conceptions are thus created to address the new conditions. The civilizations begin to create new myths about themselves, imaginaries about their divine origins, their rulers' right to govern, and people's subordinated role within these structures. The narratives of these social constructs, which are reproduced across generations and mimetically evolve to ever higher levels of sophistication, make us imagine the civilizations we live in as communities we rightfully belong in. These social imaginaries are purely fictitious. They only exist in our minds, but since we collectively assure each other that they are true, in cultural, symbolic terms they become real. Real as in there is actually something in our minds that corresponds to what we consider a civilization, and real as in the very measurable and tangible results these social constructions bring about in the physical world. With the emergence of civilizations, humans start to behave in ways that would not have been possible without such social imaginaries. Civilization is a new stage in our cultural evolution, but that does not necessarily mean that it is better than the earlier societal forms, as sometimes implied by the use of the term civilized. It simply means that it is a more complex and more efficient meme system, which, accordingly, will spread across the rest of the world, either through imitation or conquest. As in the biological evolution, the new and more efficient meme outcompetes all other lifeways, and those who do not adapt either die or become subordinated. The world becomes increasingly civilized, but, truth be told, it is far from the most civil development altogether. The growing surplus of food makes it possible to support a number of specialists to engage in non-agrarian activities, such as priests, bureaucrats, artisans, or other things requested by the power elite. The new specializations are an important prerequisite for city life and further cultural growth. The increased specialization of work functions also creates a hierarchical structure with a middle class above the primary producers and below the rulers. The growing division of labor creates higher levels of wealth, but it is far from equally distributed. The difference between poor and rich grows larger, and people's social status within the new hierarchies, usually preordained from birth, tends to determine the terms of life to a greater extent than individual skills. New productive regimes, such as agrarian civilization or capitalism, always tend to create more elitist structures, concentrating wealth, power, and status in the hands of fewer people. But this is a sad requirement to sustain the growing complexity at the initial stage of such developments. Generally, without the concentration of power, social complexity cannot function or develop to higher stages. Complex human societies simply require that someone has the necessary means to govern these structures efficiently and keep them from falling apart. For civilization to emerge and sustain itself, resources need to be amassed in a central node. Because complexity is characterized by asymmetry, and because higher complexity entails equally higher asymmetrical structures, the source of this uneven distribution of entities must be derived from somewhere. In the case of civilization, that source is the natural environment and the farmers who extract resources from it. For a new emergent phenomenon to emerge, it is essential that it has sources of energy from where it can suck orderliness from its surroundings, to use a phrase from Chapter 1, so as to fuel its complexity. As a result, it inevitably creates entropy, and thus less complexity elsewhere. With civilization, this entails an impoverished environment and population, which arguably may have been better off without it. In later stages of societal developments, we do see the emergence of counter-tendencies, new levels of complexity to address the problems created by the previous iterations. But initially, whenever a new productive regime is developed, it is characterized by growing concentrations of power and wealth controlled by a few. The new structure simply cannot emerge without it. People have good reasons to resist such developments, and in many cases some have even succeeded for a surprisingly long time, as evidenced by peoples in areas with terrains too difficult for central authorities to efficiently operate. But in most areas where agrarian societies developed, there were considerable pressures towards centralized organization. There can be many advantages for communities to remain autonomous and loosely organized, yet If a society does not succeed in allocating power to efficiently managed nodes of government, it runs the risk of losing out to those who do, and, as a consequence, becomes subjected to centralized power nevertheless, however, in a subordinated position instead. So, as a matter of Darwinian logic, following the emergence of civilization 6,000 years ago, the strongest nodes of concentrated power begin to swallow their weaker neighbors and eventually grow into vast empires. Complexity goes up, and great civilizational advances are made in and near the centers of power, but so are injustices, oppression, and the scope of violence expanded. The economic organization during the Stone Age is built on mutual interactions where people help each other, as in a family, and share whatever food is acquired with the other members of the tribe. We do so without expecting to receive a precisely measured corresponding compensation later on, because it is simply the most efficient way to ensure our survival. This system has been described as the gift economy, a system with social reciprocity as its engine. We bestow gifts on each other, which helps the group survive, but also functions as a social glue to keep it together. Gifts, as well as sacrifices, are a way of appeasing both humans and gods in the age of animism. The exchange of gifts is ritualized and embedded deep into our social imaginaries, moral systems, and customs that make up our shared symbol world. This, however, starts to change with agriculture. Those who work hard on their patch of land tend to develop a sense of ownership and want to protect it. We thereby get more extensive forms of ownership, new notions about what's mine and what's yours, and become more reluctant to share everything equally with our neighbors, especially if we perceive them as lazy or less diligent than ourselves. After all, farm work is tedious and backbreaking, not as much fun as hunting, so those who work the hardest start feeling entitled to keep what they have produced by the sweat of their brow. In addition, sedentism allows for far more wealth to accumulate, since things do not need to be carried around anymore. Our sweat and toil thereby endows us with far more possessions than before. Both these factors have great economic and political consequences. Economically, we begin to see steeper gradients of wealth, since some farmers turn out to be more skilled than others. But not only quantitative changes appear, like that of growing differences between rich and poor, even qualitative changes start to occur in our social relations, as the growing economic complexity gives rise to entirely new classes and occupations. Artisans, soldiers, religious specialists, and slaves, all with great differences in social status within the newly stratified social structure. Most profound is perhaps the change to the status of our leaders, who now emerge as a separate class, rather than just a group of particularly competent and trusted individuals in the tribe. Politically, growing social and economic complexity, which requires that some get the task of coordinating work and distributing the produce, enables them to sustain themselves exclusively from the surplus of others. They can thereby increase their power by specializing in things other than food production, for instance, organized violence, which, among other things, gives them control of the grain, a most lucrative specialization. The reason this becomes possible is because the growing population densities and the new concern with private property bring a particular issue to the forefront: security. With that, a new social logic, the quest for security through means of organized violence, starts to completely reorganize social relations. As a result, we see the emergence of elites whose main occupation is in the security business. This makes it possible to establish a new and more organized power order that persists until the late Middle Ages. This order entails that whoever has the military power to control and defend a certain area can unilaterally decide how the yields of the land should be distributed. For apparent reasons, without any sufficient military measures, people cannot resist what is to be done with their resources. The grain surplus that remains, after the peasants have received enough to survive and sow the fields, can then be used by the ruler as they please. The gift economy of foragers is thus replaced by an economic system based on the principle of redistribution. Some of the surplus is used for the ruler's own luxury consumption, but most of it is used to support the soldiers that defend the land and control the farmers. For all the local differences, and despite being initially unconnected, states around the world begin to exhibit very similar characteristics. This is likely the result of the equally similar conditions and challenges that occur when societies grow larger and more complex. All agrarian states become highly stratified societies, with elites monopolizing organized violence and taxation through means of armies, religion, and bureaucracy, and with an urban middle class specializing in artistry and trade. All around the world, agrarian civilizations always contained three, at a minimum, levels of management and exploitation. First, at the bottom are the primary producers, such as farmers, fishers, and other extractors of natural resources. Many of these are slaves, which is another near-universal feature of agrarian civilization. The primary producers are usually organized around traditional principles of village life, similar to that of the early agrarian era before the emergence of civilization, but with the exception that they are now subject to an overarching hierarchy of rulers and tribute takers, who can also draft farmers in case of war. Second, above the village level we have local elites, nobles, priests, and so on, mitigating relations to the center of power. These local power brokers extract resources by taxing the primary producers of the villages, but usually do not interfere further in their life. Third, above these local elites are where we find the sovereign rulers of the state, such as kings and sometimes queens. These rely on the resources extracted by the elites on the local level. Sometimes, with the emergence of empires, there are even rulers above the level of kings, emperors, shahs, and the like. But the outline structure, with primary producers at the bottom, a ruler at the top, and a middle level of power brokers in between, is a universal feature of all human civilizations in the agrarian regime, also sometimes referred to as the feudal system. As chieftains become kings, they now have to worry less about public opinion and more about military competitors. They can now keep a larger fraction of society's economic surplus to themselves as long as they keep their armies adequately equipped to suppress the population and fend off invaders. As a consequence, social inequalities grow rapidly. The productivity of societies grows significantly throughout the agrarian era, and, by extension, the military capacities of leaders as well. What distinguishes state formation from the earlier evolution of the agrarian regime is that it, with the words of David Christian, marks a critical transition from personal relations to impersonal power, and from power over things to power over people. People tend to be hesitant towards handing over the fruits of their labor to someone that is not family, but a well-liked and trustworthy individual who is widely respected in a local community and who is believed to manage resources in a way that benefits the greater good can convince us to give away our possessions willingly. This, however, becomes more difficult to achieve when societies grow larger and more impersonal. Humans like to give each other gifts, but they usually do not like paying taxes, and handing over resources to a person we have not even met is almost impossible without some means of coercion. So, apart from centralization, another central characteristic of states is the increasingly impersonal aspect of power they bring along. Power distances grow as societies become larger, and the chains of command expand greatly. In the new agrarian regime, it suddenly becomes common for people to never personally meet the individual who is in charge. This is something that greatly differs from the earlier power relations among hunter-gatherers, which relied on personal relations and reciprocal trust. With the growing centralization of power, distribution becomes lopsided towards the elites who control the redistribution and a privileged class of specialists. The latter's highly sought-after skills often give them a disproportionately large share of society's surplus in comparison with the primary producers. Such specialists are responsible for a high number of novel material and cultural achievements, but only a small fraction of the population is to benefit. The vast majority remain farmers who only participate in the new cultural regime of agrarian civilization by providing matter and energy to keep the states and the lifestyles of the elites going. The only thing they get in return is protection, but at the price of heavy taxation. Farmers are often pressed to the margin of subsistence, and poor harvests, wars, diseases, and plunder repeatedly make their life miserable. Yet, as they are tied to the land and usually do not have any sufficient means of physical force, they cannot escape the situation. The authority and resources they initially granted their leaders, by varying degrees of public consent, prove to be a trap that is used to further enhance the elite's grip on power. We also see a substantial change to our gender roles. The traditional division of labor among hunter-gatherers, where women primarily gather while the men go hunting, makes for a relatively equal relation of power between the sexes, since both males and females are important for producing food. But with the new conditions in agrarian society, women increasingly find themselves in a subordinated position. The first, less complex form of agriculture is often termed horticulture, and differs from agriculture proper by the fact that it does not entail ploughs, draft animals, and manure. Instead, work in the field is conducted with simple sticks or hoes to plant seeds and clear out weeds. As a logical extension of the traditional gender roles in foraging societies, this work is mainly performed by women. But when farming becomes a much heavier job with the introduction of the plough and large animals, it is transferred to the physically stronger males. Since power relations favor those providing the all-important calories, men accordingly get more powerful vis-à-vis women. This explains why more or less all agricultural societies tend to be patriarchal. Men's newly gained role as breadwinners furnishes substantial power status at home, no matter how far down the social ladder they are in society at large, as long as they provide their wives and children with the necessities to keep the household going. Women also get increasingly burdened by more childbirths, as mentioned, and since sedentary lifestyles need to address the problem of increased material entropy, garbage, that is, even more time and effort need to be spent on domestic duties. But taking care of large numbers of children and performing housework is an effective way of getting excluded from the circles of power, which are simply not located within the domestic domain of child nurture, cooking, and cleaning. As society becomes larger and more complex, and as the growing surplus of agricultural production makes it possible to support a number of new occupations, a new public sphere emerges outside the household with new opportunities for wealth and power. Since women are effectively secluded from this domain, they are likewise cut off from the resources and social positions it can provide. Their domestic duties simply do not allow them the privilege and time to devote themselves to a single specialized task outside the household. That this also includes new specialized roles from which to obtain unprecedented levels of wealth and power, now becoming the exclusive domain of men, further reinforces patriarchal structures and sentiments in society at large. That men end up dominating the most economically and politically powerful occupations, while women end up with ever more children and garbage to dispose of, thus simply strengthens the idea that men should rule and women should prepare their meals. In combination, these factors push women further into the domestic sphere, while men begin dominating the public sphere, and that's where the power is. With higher specialization, The social and productive life world of humanity splits into two distinct spheres, where the domestic sphere ends up in a more precarious situation as it increasingly relies on the resources provided from the public sphere. Basically, women end up in need of more outside assistance, and men are the ones to give them that. As such, men gain the upper hand. If a man leaves his wife and children, the family risks starvation, but the man himself, however, does not rely on his wife for his immediate survival. Under the new conditions, one could no longer just gather what one needed from nature, but relied entirely on agricultural products. And since that was provided by the public sphere that men came to dominate, women ended up in an unequal power relation of dependence towards the men. This circumstance, sometimes referred to as patriarchy, would remain unshaken until the later industrial age. Assisted by modern inventions such as birth control, electrical household appliances, and ready-made food products, along with the circumstance that men's superior physical strength no longer mattered, women could gradually gain access to the public sphere and thereby retain a more equal status, a process that is yet to reach its completion. Of all the new memes to emerge in agrarian civilization, writing is perhaps the most innovative and the one to most radically change our symbolic world. The invention of writing has been termed by John Wright as the second information revolution. The first was spoken language itself, and there is little doubt that both technologies did indeed revolutionize not only how information is handled, but also the overall complexity of human life. Writing is an essential tool for the management of large, complex civilizations. It gives us the ability to externalize our ideas in a more efficient and precise way, which agrarian civilization can use to coordinate the joint efforts of people to an extent not possible before. Written language gives us the possibility of developing much more complex collective imaginaries. Without any means of transmitting and storing information in material form, societies could not have evolved much further than that of an advanced chieftain. It simply could not have been feasible to govern large empires without any further information technologies than oral language, evidenced by the fact that all major agrarian civilizations have had some means of externally recorded information, be that knotted strings as used by the Incas, or more conventional methods of sign use, to control and organize people, matter, and energy. Power and information go hand in hand, and because the handling of information often entails control of larger amounts of complexity and power, the ones working with symbol analysis have usually been ascribed higher status than those performing manual labor. Gaining a monopoly on information eventually becomes as important to states as the monopoly on violence, and its importance has increased up to this day. What characterizes those in power in complex civilizations is not their physical strength, but their access to important information that others do not have. The most powerful societies have likewise been the ones who most efficiently handled information. Initially, written symbols were used for bookkeeping and not to record speech. Only later would they evolve to handle more abstract concepts and emotional messages. It is thus a telling sign of the nature of civilizational progress that the oldest text we have been able to decipher is that of an ordinary receipt of 29,086 measures of barley from the ancient city of Uruk. Curiously, the first name of a person we have from recorded history is thus not that of a king or a conqueror, but merely a humble accountant named Kushim, who signed this document. The ancient writing system of Sumer, commonly considered the oldest, is initially merely a system of accounting. One of the main reasons that we have such plentiful evidence of this ancient system is because of the coincidence that it was engraved into tablets of durable clay. It is, however, given the conditions in early agrarian civilizations, probably not a coincidence that the oldest systematized writing system we know of is one of recording debts and financial transactions. The needs of recording past debts and financial transactions are simply much more urgent in ancient civilization than that of recording poems or tales. And, given the complexity of such activities, the former has been much more likely to emerge before the latter. When we study the clay tablets of ancient Sumer, it becomes obvious that credit systems are in fact a very old invention, one that predates coinage, which only emerges several millennia later. Even though silver is the official currency of ancient Sumer, silver does not circulate in Sumerian society and is not used for everyday transactions, just as gold was not used back when the US dollar was pegged to the gold standard. The value of goods is compared to its perceived worth in silver, but peasants and merchants are not required to pay their taxes or debts in silver and can pay in almost everything else of value. So, even if silver is nominally the currency, signs engraved into modest clay functions as the de facto currency, and as in any modern market economy later on, most transactions in Sumer are based on credit. These tablets of clay function as IOUs. They are often traded, and as such, they are the first historically recorded instance of money anywhere in the world. This circumstance reveals what has been increasingly obvious since the modern world relinquished its dependence on precious metals, that money, basically, is nothing but promissory notes, or debt, in another word, notions of how much the holder of an IOU is deserving of. Promissory notes have repeatedly served as money, as periods of crisis again and again have revealed when cash flows dried up. Taverns have always had credit systems, even in ancient Sumer, and such notes have often been traded and used as a currency. It is thus revealing that money, when it is invented in ancient Sumer, emerges from the first known instant of debt recording anywhere in the world. In a way, we can say that money is written into existence. We need to keep in mind that money is not a physical object, like that of coins, for instance, with any intrinsic worth of its own. Money is simply information, and as such, an information technology that only becomes possible with the invention of writing. With this technology, we can make records of people's past labor and estimate its value as judged by society. Spending money is an informational act that sends a signal to confirm one's wants to the people involved in satisfying them. A difference between exchanges involving money and simple bartering, for example, precious metals for other goods, is that money often has a value above the perceived value of the metal itself, and most often money has functioned without any involvement of precious metals or any other valuable materials at all. As an information technology, one involving information about who owes what to whom, or more specifically, how much the debt of a person is worth in relation to others, money can be seen as a kind of IOU. And IOUs, contrary to the expectation of returned favors as those prevailing in a gift economy, require writing to determine their actual worth. By writing down debts, the trust barrier between strangers can also be overcome. This is necessary in the large and dense societies of the later agrarian era, where we do not know each other as well as before, but still enjoy a high enough level of security to conduct peaceful transactions with one another. With debts in writing, it makes it harder for borrowers to deny the existence of a loan or for lenders to exaggerate it. Yet such contracts only have any value in societies with a monopoly on violence to defend these claims. When money does not have any worth on its own, such as clay tablets as opposed to precious metals, its value is only as high as the level of organized violence to defend it. If the recordings of debts are not supported by military means to collect it if a borrower refuses to pay, then they are essentially worthless. And only when someone defends the value of a legal tender with organized violence can its value exceed that of the metal or other materials it is made of. We thus see how the state and its means of organized violence and the invention of writing and of money, which at first were more or less the same thing, make up two of the most central memes of civilization. But the state and money are more than a coercive measure of control and an informational system of economic organization, respectively. They are very much social imaginaries, purely mental constructs that first become real when enough people believe in their truth claims. Only when we begin to act as if they were real entities and bestow them with some kind of essence in our symbol world can the myths of the state and money become effective organizational principles in society. And we need to do so collectively. We need to confirm with each other that they are real, that they are more than just imagination, and those societies to do so most effectively also become the most powerful. This requires further means than purely administrative ones. On a systemic level, there are certain limits to how well the state can affect our behaviors by coercion alone, and how much trust can be instilled in a currency that is essentially made of worthless numbers. Hence, we need a cultural dimension to make these imaginaries believable. Some set of shared symbols and narratives to make us forget for a moment that they are purely fictitious. With the emergence of civilization, there are thus great efforts put into making states and money integral parts of our symbol world. Religion, art, and rituals are used in ever more sophisticated ways to prop up these social constructs with meaning and beauty. The myths of the state and money will become so integral to our understanding of the world that we eventually cannot imagine the world without them. Over time, they become self-evident, naturally given facts that few ever question or ponder their purely imaginary nature, and eventually, the invention of writing itself proves a most effective tool to enhance these social imaginaries in our shared symbol world, as myth can now be put into writing and saved for future generations. In the beginning, writing was, as mentioned, only used for accounting purposes and other administrative measures for which it had been invented, what has been termed sectorial literacy. But later it penetrates into the central core of our culture, which then gives rise to what has been called cultural literacy. When that happens, our writing systems become much more advanced. We go from systems where individual signs are used to signify material objects, for instance, a silver ingot or a bundle of barley, to a system where signs are used for the sounds in our spoken language. This dramatically increases the utility and efficiency of written language. Instead of having to write and interpret a great number of signs, a limited number of syllables is sufficient, which also provides more flexibility and precision. This opens up entirely new ways of relating to our symbol world. According to Jan Assmann, this form of writing restructures not only thought, but also, under certain cultural circumstances, the whole network of relations between human beings, man and society, man and cosmos, man and God and cosmos. This is because, as he elaborates, writing serves as a special kind of symbols that bestow visibility to the invisible, stability to the volatile, and wide dissemination to the locally confined. Oral language, on the contrary, uses sound symbols that are invisible, volatile, and locally restricted. What writing and literacy on this level accomplish is thus the opening up of a whole new way of relating to the world, a way in which aspects of reality, hitherto invisible and difficult to grasp, can be scrutinized and brought under the control of human beings. With writing, it also becomes possible to record and archive past events and thus produce history. Because history has the capacity to document the doings of kings and conditions created by humans, not only gods, it will eventually dispel and replace the old mythology of the early agrarian religions. Disregarding the actual validity of such records, written historical memory has a verifiability and truth value about past events that exceed those of myths. and in these records, the actions of humans take precedence from those of gods. With this development, we see a first step towards a more rational and secular worldview, though it will take more than a couple of thousand years of mythical and religious thinking before a fully rational worldview emerges in the later centuries of the second millennium CE. Parallel and largely connected with the growing complexity of human societies, the capacity to store and transmit information has increased enormously, both in volume and range, while the costs have gone down. This appears to be a general law of history, and one that has resulted in an ever greater ability to learn from others and manipulate matter and energy, from which further complexity and divisions of labour, but also increased social inequality, have been the consequences. With writing, our collective brain has grown larger. With written language, cultural development will also progress much faster. Writing allows for the pace of development to speed up as new ideas and information can more easily spread and accumulate across generations and geographical boundaries. Written language will thus have great significance for the human being's continued cultural development. A community can only hold a certain number of stories and myths alive in oral tradition, but with writing, it becomes possible to ensure a more exact and undistorted transfer of a greater number of narratives and the construction of a much richer and more diverse symbol world. This facilitates one of the most decisive developments in human history that will be the topic of the next chapter: organized religion.